Welcome back to the Neuroscience Meets Social and Emotional Learning podcast, episode number 88. With Dr. Andrew Newberg, an American neuroscientist who's the Director of Research at the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital, and the author of 10 books translated into 6 languages and over 200 articles on neuroimaging and neuropsychiatric disorders, and also on neuroscience and religion. My name is Andrea Samadi, and if you're new here, I'm a former educator who created this podcast to bring the most current neuroscience research, along with high-performing experts who've risen to the top of their field, with specific ideas or strategies that you can implement immediately, whether you're an educator or in the corporate space, to take your results to the next level. If we want to improve our social, emotional, and cognitive abilities, it all starts with an understanding of our brain. I am thrilled to have this opportunity to speak with Andrew, as he's been exploring the topic of neurotheology, which addresses the relationship between the brain and religious experiences since his teenage years. Andrew is the co-author of the best-selling book, How God Changes Your Brain, which was chosen by Oprah for her book club that same year in 2009, and Why God Won't Go Away, Brain Science and the Biology of Belief, which both explore the relationship between neuroscience and spiritual experience. He's also co-authored Words Can Change Your Brain, Why We Believe What We Believe, Uncovering Our Biological Need for Meaning, Spirituality, and Truth, and The Mystical Mind, Probing the Biology of Belief. The latter book received the 2000 award for Outstanding Books in Theology and the Natural Sciences, presented by the Center for Theology and Natural Sciences, which is an organization that focuses on building bridges between theology and science. I've got some powerful, insightful, thought-provoking questions for Andy, and I know you'll find this topic interesting, especially with his ability to share his insights and years of research from the point of view of pure science. Welcome, Andy, and thank you so much for being here for this fascinating topic today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on the program.
Well, for anyone who knows your schedule, Andy, this is a rare opportunity, and I am so grateful for Mark Waldman for connecting us after the webinar that you did last week. And you addressed many of these powerful and mind-boggling questions that I'm going to ask you today on that webinar, but I just know that people around the world will benefit from this. And the podcast does reach over 110 countries right now, so it's pretty exciting that people around the world, they were just thrilled with this. I actually posted, before we had set our time together, I posted that I was going to be interviewing you, and I just put a graphic together with your book, How God Changes Your Brain. And the messages started coming in all over the world. People were like, I've got to watch this episode. And I thought, Andy better show up for me. So thank you.
That's the only reason I showed up.
That's funny. Well, so can we just start with this topic, because it just seems like everybody wants to know this. Where did your interest in religion and the human brain begin? What is neurotheology, and what does neuroscience say about whether there's a God or not?
Oh, wow. That's the 3 big questions. Well, I mean, as far as my own background goes and my own interest, as you mentioned in the introduction, I mean, I've really been thinking about these things since I was a kid. I was just always, I had this burning question, which to me was always kind of the fundamental big question about how do we know what's real, and how do we understand what reality is, and whether what we think is real is real. And I think a lot of that did stem from my concern, if you will, or my lack of understanding about why there were so many different religions, why there were so many different political perspectives, especially obviously in today's world. To me, it's like, if we're all looking at the same world, why don't we just all think the same thing? And so clearly we don't. And so I said, well, let me start by looking at the human brain. Let me try to understand, theoretically, that's the part of us that is interpreting the information that's coming into us and making some sense out of the world around us. So I said, let me start with science and looking at the brain and how that works. But as I went through my training, I began to realize that science didn't, while science is fantastic, it didn't really have the ability to answer certain fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness and the nature of reality, and at least in terms of how we perceive it. And so I got into looking at different philosophical perspectives and different spiritual perspectives as well. And all of this stuff was kind of swirling around in my own mind, thinking about how do I kind of blend all this together. And I had the good fortune when I was in medical school to connect with two fantastic mentors, one who was in the neuroimaging field, which is what I got into and became a kind of a fundamental part of my career, using brain imaging to study Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and depression and so forth. And then also with another gentleman who was a psychiatrist by training, and he had been thinking about the relationship between the brain and religion for an even longer time. And at some point there was this little light bulb that went off. I said, well, gee, if we're studying the brain of people with Alzheimer's, why can't we study the brain of people who are religious or spiritual or doing certain practices like meditation and prayer? And that was what launched our studies into this. And over the last 25 years or so, we've studied maybe 400 or 500 people doing all different kinds of practices from all different kinds of traditions. And it has really, I think, advanced this whole idea of neurotheology. Now, interestingly, the very first mention of the term, at least that I could find, came from a novel in the early 1960s by Aldous Huxley, called The Island, and it talks about this futuristic society that does all this kind of weird stuff, and one of the things is neurotheology, but he doesn't really describe it beyond that. So the way I usually define neurotheology is that it is a field of study that is designed to look at the relationship between the brain and our religious and spiritual selves. With that in mind, I think there's a couple of really important aspects of that I'd like to stress. So one of them is that it is a two-way street, meaning that it's not just science looking at religion, it's not just theology or religion trying to analyze the value of science, but it is the two of these sides together, coming together to look at each other and also ultimately to help us understand ourselves. And so, if you think historically, the two kind of greatest forces in human history have been science and technology on one side and religion and spirituality on the other. So why not bring them together in some way that hopefully is constructive and beneficial? And so one of the important concepts in neurotheology is that it's a very multidisciplinary, and it's not really trying to take one side or the other, but really trying to help us understand ourselves. And then the other thing I like to say about neurotheology, at least as a term, if it's going to work as the term that we use for this field, is that the neuro side and the theology side have to be expanded pretty substantially. So the neuro side includes neuroscience, neuroimaging, it includes medicine, looking at the various ways in which our brain and body are interconnected with each other. And so, anthropology, psychology, all these different ways in which we think about the neuro-ish side of who we are. And then the theology side is also not just theology proper, which is a specific discipline designed to kind of analytically look at a given religious tradition, but needs to also be expanded to include things like religious beliefs and practices and experiences, mystical experiences, and so forth. Morals, maybe even philosophical questions about free will, everything that kind of spills over into how we use religious and spiritual ideas to help us understand the world and how we experience that. So with that in mind, that to me is what neurotheology is ultimately about. And then it helps us to begin to, do these kinds of studies where we look at the brain. And I guess that was the third question, which is, how does our brain kind of intersect with religion and spirituality? And I guess to me, a couple of real, kind of main take-home messages about the research that we've done. And like I said, we've studied maybe 400 or 500 people doing all different kinds of practices. And there are other colleagues who have done, additional research as well. I think one important point is that there does not seem to be just, one part of the brain that is involved in spirituality. It's not like when you walk into church, this one little part of the brain lights up and we feel spiritual, and then when we walk out of the church, it goes away. And I think when people, anybody who's had any kind of spiritual experience or had some type of, importance of religion in their lives, understands that there are emotional aspects, there are experiential aspects, there are social aspects, there's cognitive and philosophical aspects. So, from my view, and when we look at our brain scans and the models that we've developed in terms of the areas of our brain that are involved in this, it's really virtually the entire brain that gets involved. So if there's a part of our brain that is the spiritual part, it's really the whole thing. And I'm in the center of integrative medicine, so we recognize the link between our brain and body, and therefore everything that happens up here is also kind of happening throughout our body in certain ways. And so it's really all of us, which is the spiritual part of ourselves. So our biology and our spirituality are really intimately intertwined. And again, part of the goal of neurotheology is to try to tease that out and to understand that and understand what that means, and to think about any, the practical applications of that, all the way to the very esoteric philosophical implications of it.
Wow, it's deep, and it's a lot to think about, and that's why we brought you on here, just to dive deep into this. And I have to ask this question here because I grew up going to church every Sunday and read and studied the Bible, and I really do believe in the 10 Commandments, but I still don't know how I would explain God other than the fact I just know he exists. Like, there's times when I'm in nature, I feel more connected. And I know you've scanned the brains of Franciscan nuns and charted the neurological changes that happen in their brains, but what do you think God is from your research? Is it the same as consciousness? Is it like, how would we even go and dive in and explain it? Is there, and you said there's not even a certain area of your brain that connects religion to my beliefs. Like, you couldn't put me in a brain scan and say, oh, she believes or not, right?
Correct. I wrote a book called The Principles of Neurotheology, and really designed to sort of think about how we begin to tackle all these kinds of questions. And the question that you ask is a very central issue for obviously the field of neurotheology and for the study of religion and spirituality. One of the things that I think is a very important part of what neurotheology kind of asks us to do is to ask questions. And so when it comes to what is the nature of God, what is free will, what is consciousness, there are lots of ways of trying to answer that question. And part of what we have to do is not be afraid of thinking about all the ways in which we can address that question. And when we talk about definitions, I can go to the Bible and I say, this is what it says God is, or this is what it says being religious is. I can go to the great theologians of history and St. Anselm and Aquinas and so forth, and I can look at their definitions. I can go to a church or a synagogue and I can ask each of the congregants, what do you think? And in our book, How God Changes Your Brain, one of the things, one of the sort of cute little studies that we did, if you will, was we asked people to draw a picture of God the way they would, when they think about God, what do they envision? And it was really fascinating to see how people drew God. About 20% of people drew some kind of face, something anthropomorphic, kind of humanized version of God. I would say about a third of people drew some kind of, you mentioned nature, so they would just draw like a nature scene and very bucolic, hills and, mountains and stuff like that. Another third of the people would actually draw some type of abstract picture. So swirls, a heart, some type of, interesting design or something like that, rainbow kind of thing. And so that was interesting. And then what I found actually was particularly interesting was that there was a group of about maybe 10 or 15% who actually left it blank. And we weren't satisfied with just getting the pictures. We asked people to describe them because we didn't want to put our own biases into interpreting these things. And the responses on the blanks were actually really interesting, because some of the people who left it blank were atheists, and they said, well, there is no God, I'm leaving it blank. There was another group of people who left it blank who were deeply religious individuals who said God is undrawable, and left it blank. Wow. So, these are the kinds of things that we can get at to try to understand an answer to your kind of a question. Who do we ask? Do we ask the theologians? Do we ask the philosophers? Do we ask the sociologists, the neuroscientists, and most importantly, the general population, what they think? I tend to state that, because each brain is so unique, if there's, 7.5 billion people in the world, there's 7.5 billion religions in the world, and there's 7.5 billion ideas about God. Now, obviously, there's a lot of overlap, and most people would probably talk about God as an ultimate, being or consciousness or spiritual power. But again, one of the, even in your question when you were talking about how does that relate to consciousness? When we look at people who have had intense spiritual experiences, one of the, I think, fascinating questions about it is that everyone describes them a little bit differently. And so some people say that, when they connect with God, they felt love, and other people felt awe, and some people felt a power, and some people felt energy. And so, are they fundamentally the same experience that people are now describing differently based on their beliefs or their culture or whatever? Or are they literally different experiences? And again, I mean, arguably, if God is infinite and can manifest in any different kind of way, then yeah, it's the famous story about a bunch of flies buzzing around an elephant, and one of them thinks an elephant is a tusk, and one of them thinks it's a trunk, and one of them thinks it's a tail, and they're all right, but they're also all wrong. I mean, none of them really fully are able to capture exactly what that is. So clearly the concept of God is something that is kind of beyond human comprehension. But that being said, we still go about trying to comprehend it.
And ask questions and keep learning and keep reading books like yours, which was very insightful. I know you covered this on the training that you did for us last week with Mark Waldman's group, but I think it's so important to talk about today. And it's about the power of intercessory prayer, or praying on behalf of others. And right. It's actually a component in Dan Siegel's Wheel of Awareness meditation. So within his meditation, he asks you to send loving kindness to people in our communities and people maybe far away. But what does your research say about praying for someone far away? Can we even measure, what if somebody's praying but not praying right? Not sending the right loving intention, just saying, oh, I'm praying for them. But is there a way to measure if you're doing this the right way? And can we really impact people from far away?
Right. Well, this is over the years, as I have done this kind of research, one of the things as a researcher that I get excited about are thinking about these methodological challenges. And, studying spirituality, studying prayer is not an easy thing to do, no matter how you're trying to do it. And so it raises lots of fascinating scientific questions as well as spiritual questions. In fact, one of the things I always remind my colleagues about when I give a talk to a group of psychiatrists or neuroscientists is that this whole field of research really challenges science, because you're trying to grapple with things that are very difficult to hold on to and to measure in any kind of accurate way. So, when it comes to things like intercessory prayer, well, first of all, let's start with the obvious, which is that for the person doing the praying, there seems to be, benefit to them. It helps them when you think loving thoughts. Data shows that you calm your brain down, you feel better, you reduce your stress, you reduce your anxiety and depression. And so there is a direct benefit to the people who are even starting to do that kind of a practice. But obviously the more interesting question is, well, but are you actually able to affect somebody at a distance? And now, while I personally haven't done a lot of specific research looking at intercessory prayer practices, the data that exists out there, and there are a number of studies that have looked at this, some have shown an effect, meaning, sometimes people are praying for patients who are in the hospital. That's a typical model for these studies, to try to recover faster from heart surgery or cancer or whatever. And for the most part, like I said, a number of studies have shown that those people who are being prayed for get out of the hospital, on average a little bit earlier. So maybe a half a day earlier, which is a statistically significant difference. There have been some other studies that have shown that it hasn't specifically worked. So I think in terms of the actual research, we still have to demonstrate this a little bit more specifically. I don't think we know for sure if it does work, but some of the challenges with that is, are we doing, are they even doing the studies the right way? And, you mentioned, like, are they praying correctly? And what does that mean to pray correctly? So, and I think that, a lot of these studies are designed for people to pray. They hand me, they would hand me a name, John Smith, who's over in, at UCLA or something like that. Well, it's, 2,000 miles away, and I don't know who this person is. I would think that that could be completely different than me praying for my father or something like that, who's in the hospital. And, but it raises all kinds of really interesting, assuming that there is an effect, you get all these very interesting questions. Does it matter if you have, 10 people praying for somebody instead of 5 people? You get double the effect. Does it matter if the people who are praying are deeply religious people who really believe in the prayers that they're doing versus just pulling a bunch of people off the street and saying, here, just think some good thoughts for these people? Does the distance matter? Is it different if, I live in Philadelphia, so if I pray for somebody at a Philadelphia hospital, is that more effective than praying for somebody in California? And then ultimately there is the bigger mechanistic question, which is, let's assume that for a moment that this does work. What exactly is happening? Is the prayer going up to God and then God is truly intervening for this individual? Is it human consciousness in some way that kind of reaches across? And certainly there are people who make that argument as well. So, we don't know. And that is part of what we want to try to find out in some way. What is the mechanism by which these things work? Do they work? And if so, how? And if so, what are the ways of sort of optimizing it? So it's a great area. I talk about neurotheology being kind of a big jigsaw puzzle that has lots of little, lots of individual pieces. I don't know if I should say little pieces, but lots of individual pieces. And intercessory prayer is one of them. And it's a very fast, how does wouldn't it be great to scan the brain and to see, if it, at the times that it does work, that a person's brain pattern is different than the times that it doesn't work. So all kinds of really interesting questions for us that lie ahead.
That's mind-boggling. I love this. This is so interesting. But you also mentioned last week that you did a brain scan in a study that you were doing. You were doing an MRI, and they measured your brain and your memory, and they asked you to remember 10 words. And this caught my attention because I actually just had a SPECT scan done on my brain. And the results showed that I scored very low on recall memory. I actually got 1 out of 10. And, self-evaluation, I'm like, that's accurate, because for the life of me, I couldn't remember these 10 words that, like cheese and bread and whatever, they're just random words. But I can remember conversations from 30 years ago if emotion was attached. Right. And like speeches people said, I can quote them from 12 years ago. So from the scans that you've done, what do you think are good strategies for people like me that would be looking to improve memory recall? Because I know it's going to become important as I'm aging. How did you do on that memory test? And then what other techniques have you seen people use to improve their memory?
Well, they didn't tell me how I did, so I don't know. Well, I mean, we're in the process actually of writing a book on brain health, and one of the things that we frequently talk to our patients about is everybody has to recognize what their own strengths and weaknesses are. So, for example, I wouldn't say that you have bad memory. It's just that you have different, your ability to remember different things cuts across different domains of memory, and some people are really good at remembering pictures, some are really good at remembering names, some are really good at remembering events. And so, one of the things that we always have to try to do is use our strengths. And to the extent that we can use those strengths to perhaps help us in other domains, that could be something that might be helpful. So, for example, if you were being asked to remember just a random set of 10 words, maybe if you could have woven that into a speech, that as you were listening to the words, you could have remembered the speech and then remembered the words. So we do try to get people to sort of, use where their strengths are. And then, if they're not really good with names, then try to remember, some characteristic about the person that you can then attach the name to. And these are kind of traditional learning techniques as well. But the whole key is that you have to kind of recognize where your strengths are, where your weaknesses are, and then try to utilize the strengths and use them to help overcome where some of the weaknesses are. I think the other thing that is also important is to think about, how does one try to improve your brain over time? And I often use the muscle analogy because what I'll say to people is, look, if you want to become a really good basketball player, well, you've got to practice basketball. You've got to shoot a lot of basketballs, and you got to do a lot of layups and stuff like that. And so if you do that over and over and over again, there's a training effect, and your muscles get used to that. And that's in part because your brain gets used to it. So your brain changes over time to develop the skills and the motor skills and the coordination that you need for that particular thing. If you want to become a really good basketball player, you don't go out and hit baseballs. That's different domains. And just because you're good at one doesn't make you good at the other. Now, on the other hand, whether you want to be a good baseball player, a good basketball player, a good football player, you might lift weights because, the stronger you are, the better you are in all of them. You might run or do, aerobic exercise because the better shape you're in, the better you'll be able to do the different things that you're doing. And so the brain works the same kind of way. If you love to do crossword puzzles and you do crossword puzzles a lot, you're going to get really good at doing crossword puzzles, but that doesn't inherently mean that you are going to be, that you're going to remember where you put your keys, or that you're going to remember the name of that person that you just met. You're going to get really good at doing crossword puzzles. But then there are the more general practices like lifting weights or doing aerobic exercise that can be good no matter what. And those specifically include things like meditation. Prayer practices can be very good general training techniques because they help with concentration. They help to modulate your stress levels so that you can perform well even under duress. And so when you do these kinds of practices over time, and we have brain scan studies that show this, that you change the way your brain works. We did a study of a meditation practice called Kirtan Kriya, where it's a very concentrative practice, and you activate your frontal lobes, which is what happens in a lot of these practices whenever you're concentrating. And so we showed that over time, as people did this practice, even at rest, their frontal lobes were more active, and that correlated with improvements in their concentration in general. And so, we know that these kinds of practices, meditation in particular, tends to kind of cut across a lot of different domains to help people. But so one strategy is to try to do those general kinds of practices like meditation. And then the other, as Mark Waldman and I often talk about in our books, is that we have all these different domains. We have all these different ways of doing memory. We have, emotions and all that. The more you use all the different parts of your brain, the better off you are. So don't just do crossword puzzles, but do crossword puzzles, do Sudoku, take a walk outside, listen to a podcast on the political system, read a book on neuroscience. So the more you do all of, talk to your friends about, the world or whatever. So the more you do all of these different things, the better your overall brain function will become.
You do talk about that with, I think there's a case study in your book. I think it was How God Changes Your Brain, with a guy named Gus. He was a construction worker and he had a weak memory, and you just put him on a meditation program. And
yeah, that was the Kirtan Kriya meditation, right?
Oh, and, was it? Okay.
Yeah, and he was this very kind of rough and tumble kind of guy, and I was like, we'll see how this guy does. And he was really cute about the whole thing, and he really got into it. And apparently, I don't know if he said this in the book, but he got up very early every day. So he started to do this at like 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and it's a singing meditation. So the person that we had the audio tape. One of the things it tells you to do is to really kind of belt it out. So at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, he's in his apartment complex belting out this meditation. And I think he started to do it a little quieter. He did it a little later in the day, but
Right.
yeah, he really loved it. Part of why I liked it as a as a clinician, we always try to look for things that are more simple, easy, obviously low cost. I mean, there's a lot of practical pieces to all of this. People say, well, if you tell me to meditate 2 hours a day, if I had 2 hours a day to meditate, I wouldn't be as stressed as I am. So, but this particular practice is very nice because it's 12 minutes a day. It's hard for people to say, I don't have 12 minutes.
Right.
And that is an important point also, which is that whatever things people do, whatever practices people try to do, it's important for it to be something that they can do, that they feel comfortable with, that they feel that they can really engage, because that's also another piece of all of this that we have learned over the years, which is that to just go through the motions of a practice, to just sit in church and not really, but be on your phone, you're not really getting much out of that. The more involved you are, the more engaged you are, the more your brain ultimately gets out of everything. So, and that's true really across the board. It includes spirituality, but it includes, training and education and all that. You need to be doing things that you really care about and that you can do and enjoy. And the more you do that, then the bigger the impact will be.
Well, it makes complete sense. And it's nice to hear that meditation's not just for certain people, that it can go mainstream, which was nice to see. And I know you mentioned that you're writing a book right now on health, and it's kind of an interest for me, especially after getting my brain scan and seeing all these areas that, we want to make sure that the next 50 plus years of our life are healthy. We all know that the staples like sleep, diet, and exercise are important for protecting the aging brain. But what right now are you seeing? Is there anything else that you're seeing is important for us to practice to preserve our brain health?
Well, you mentioned a couple of the fundamentals, and and we shouldn't gloss over them because they are so important. So things like diet and nutrition, in our integrative medicine practices here, I mean, we just see so many people coming in, and you start getting, very granular in terms of their diet and what they eat. And a lot of people do not eat well. They often eat a lot of processed foods, and they cheat a lot on their diets, and they so we really try to get people to a much healthier, plant-based, protein-based kind of diet. There's been a lot of data out there, including some of my other colleagues as well, where we've shown that just fixing your diet alone can be so fundamentally important to keeping your brain healthy, because one, it begins to provide the right nutrients for your brain. But the other problem is that when you're eating a lot of these, problematic foods, if you will, the processed foods and red meats and dairy products and things like that, there's a lot of inflammatory molecules that are in those foods, and so they cause inflammation in the body, and it's almost as if you're sort of always living with this little low-grade inflammation. It's like you're almost always fighting the cold type of thing. And how do people feel when you're doing that? Well, you feel brain fog, and you don't feel sharp, and your concentration is down. So that is certainly an important thing. Getting the right amount of sleep, also, fundamental, and people do need to kind of look at that and, if they really have problems with it, consider, a more formal evaluation, doing a sleep study and making sure that they don't have things like sleep apnea and so forth. Very, very important. And maybe thinking about a meditation practice or other sort of stress relieving practices at night, to help with their, help them to get a good night's sleep and to maintain that level of sleep. We also find some interesting things as well. One of Mark's favorites is yawning. And so, why do we yawn? We yawn when we are tired, and it's actually a way for our brain to kind of wake itself up. So if you begin to just actually like fake a few yawns, and then you ultimately start to do this more naturally. And if you do it over a period of a couple of minutes, you're bringing in more oxygen into your brain. There's some theories that the airflow that comes up into your nasal passages helps to cool the brain down and ultimately allow the brain to function more effectively. So there's that. And then maybe the last thing to just mention briefly for everyone is, is the notion of what we say, having faith, being optimistic. When you kind of follow a spiritual path, when you feel that the world is fundamentally a good place, when you're optimistic about the future, there's a lot of data that support the idea that those positive emotions and that positive outlook on things is really very good for you. It's very good for your brain. It's very good for your health. It reduces your mortality rates and reduces your risk of getting heart disease and other disorders. So, having that faith, whether it is a more secular-based optimism or something truly spiritual, all of those seem to be beneficial in terms of helping people to do better and keep their brain and their body as healthy as possible.
It's also interesting we can be doing all those things and think that we're doing them all right, and then you go get a blood test and something shows up that, just knowing your numbers is another strategy too, because you just don't know unless you look at certain parts of your health. You think you're doing well, and then it's like right in front of you, oh, why is this so high? What am I doing?
Right, absolutely. I mean, we have an executive health program, and we do some very thorough laboratory testing, and yeah, I mean, it is amazing how many people have different issues and problems that they don't realize, and so it is, it's not necessarily that you have to get checked, every 6 months or every year, even if you're really, really healthy and you're feeling great, but it's certainly important to do it once in a while to make sure that you do understand, where you are with things and what is the best kind of path forward so that you can manage things as appropriately as possible. So many things we don't even feel, like our cholesterol levels and stuff like that. But if your cholesterol levels are high, you need to understand that. You need to be taking that into consideration. You need to be thinking about it. There's a lot of new genetic testing these days. And sometimes that can help because you do want to do the best that you can at understanding where your strengths and weaknesses are, both in terms of how your brain works, but also how your body works. And, if cholesterol is not a problem for you, that's great. And then you can, worry about other things. But if it is a problem for you, then, you do want to manage it, and you want to manage it effectively.
Absolutely. Well, we have covered paradigms on this podcast with different episodes. We've talked about like how we can change them. But I know that you covered this a little bit in the past. I've heard you talking about it. But from your experience of working with the brain, what are beliefs? How do they form? Where are they stored? And how do we change outdated beliefs that we've had from the past that don't help us or serve us in the future?
Well, our beliefs really are comprised of our emotions, our cognitive processes, the social interactions and the memories that we form from all of that. And they're embedded within the wiring of the brain. They become biological. That there is something that attaches in our brain to a given idea, a given belief, a given memory. And one of the things we talk about in our book, Why We Believe What We Believe, is that on one hand we need to understand where all those beliefs come from, and obviously a lot of them do come from outside. People who we talk to are obviously our parents first, who teach us the beliefs often about religion and spirituality, but just, not to turn your glass upside down, clean up your room, just some basic morals about the world. And then we learn from our teachers and our friends and then our, people in the world, celebrities and politicians and so forth. So our beliefs come from a lot of different sources. And then of course, we think about them as well. What is interesting is that as these beliefs get written into the neural connections of our brain, they become stronger and stronger. There's a cute phrase that neurons that fire together wire together, and that there's a basis behind that. But the more you focus on anything, the more that belief becomes ingrained in who you are. So if you are a Muslim, the more you read the Quran, the more you do Muslim prayers, then those are the beliefs that become a part of your brain. If you're Christian, the same thing. And the same is true for academics and for politics and everything. When those beliefs work for you and help you to be a good person and a good, a compassionate person and someone who's successful and good in society and helpful to other people, then all of that's great. But there are times where there are negative beliefs that creep in, even in somebody who's generally doing really well. And obviously there are people who really struggle in the world and deal with, very negative beliefs about themselves, about the world around them. They can lead to anxiety and depression, fear and anger. The changing them is difficult. As I said, these are written into the neural connections of our brain, and it literally takes neuronal energy to break them. But the good news is that they can be broken, and there are ways of trying to, the other phrase is use it or lose it. And so if you redirect your beliefs from negative, hateful, angered beliefs into something that is more compassionate, we talked about earlier on, doing a meditation on sending loving and compassionate thoughts to people. Well, when you do that, you don't send hate, you don't have those hateful feelings, you don't have anger and so forth. And over time, your brain will literally shift in terms of its physiology, as well as in the beliefs that you actually hold. So no matter how old you are, your brain can always change, and it can always start to adapt towards something different. And of course, it can go in both directions. So the more, this is the problem that a lot of us face in the United States today, that, we have certain political beliefs. And so we watch the news that supports those beliefs and gets us upset and gets us angry. And it just, kind of keeps cycling, instead of saying, well, let me hear what the other side has to say. Let me stop focusing on the negative, and let me find the good news in the world. Let me find the people who are helping other people instead of the people who are harming other people, and work in those kinds of directions. And again, it's not, there's no magic way to do it per se. It takes effort, it takes time, but it is doable. And maybe the last thing to say about that is that in our book, How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain, when every once in a while people have these really profound spiritual experiences, enlightenment experiences, if you will. And what the data shows is that, pretty much anyone can have these experiences. So they are available to everyone. For some, it happens out of the blue. For other people, they have a lifetime of striving for them. But what's particularly fascinating about it is that whenever they do happen to occur for somebody, they are almost uniformly considered to be extremely positive and powerful and transformative. And the one, from a neuroscience perspective, one of the really interesting things about those experiences is that even though they can last, literally seconds or minutes, they seem to rewire the whole brain. They completely change how the person thinks about their world and thinks about themselves. And so, there are a lot of different ways in which our brain can change, either very, very slowly over time, or sometimes, just like that. But they can all lead to very positive ways of thinking about things.
Well, these are some powerful concepts, Andy, to think about. In closing, is there anything that you think is really important that we've missed, that we haven't discussed today?
Well, I think that, maybe the thing that I would just leave people with goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning in some regard. And part of why I got into all of this is, how do we know what reality is, and how do we experience reality? And what I like to say to everyone, and this came about in our book on beliefs, is that our brains have access to the most infinitesimal percentage of all the information that's out there in the universe, and yet actually does a reasonably good job at telling us that we understand what's going on in the world, and gives us a reason to get up in the morning, kind of thing. But on the other hand, we have to be careful about that, because so often we think that we actually fully understand the world, when again, we're literally getting, I actually tried to do a calculation one time, and I got to about 10 to the minus 67%. So 0.00 with 67 zeros and a 1. The information that is accessible to us. And then our brain, with its genetics and our environment and our parents and our friends and all these other factors, all of our brains are in the same boat, in the sense that we're all looking out at the world, trying to make some sense out of it with whatever pieces of information we can get, and come up with something that seems to work. So it is not a surprise that we all come up with different perspectives on things, and that we have sometimes radically different views. And so, it kind of gets back to that fundamental question I have. It's not a surprise that we have these different views, but perhaps by understanding this, we recognize the value of being compassionate and open and understanding to people who do come to ideas that are different than ours, because it's not that they're fundamentally evil necessarily or bad people or whatever. It's just that their brains are looking at the world in a slightly different way that we are, and then ultimately that brings them to different conclusions. So I, one of the to me, one of the take-home messages of neurotheology is a respect and compassion and an understanding of how people come to these different ideas, and that it may be okay that we all come to those different ideas. We have to figure out, how to bring us together in that regard and find ways of kind of using the distinctions in those ideas to help all of us try to understand ourselves and our relationship to the world more effectively.
What a positive end note there, Andy. Thank you so much for your time, for sharing these powerful concepts on neurotheology, the aging brain. There was just so much in there. Thank you so much for this. I'm looking forward to your book on health. When is that coming out?
Probably sometime next year. We're just in the process of finishing it. So
incredible. I look forward to that. I've put all your books in the show notes, and thank you so much. You have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
If you're enjoying the Neuroscience Meets Social and Emotional Learning podcast, please don't forget to subscribe so you'll stay up to date with our new episode. While you're there, please feel free to give us a review or a 5-star rating, as it helps others find us. For more information on our programs, books, and tools for schools and the workplace, visit us at www.achieveit360.com.